The smell of burned coffee hung in the air of the processing barn like an accusation, and I stood there holding a burlap sack that contained the only truth anyone in that room would ever need to hear. My sister's laugh cut through the August heat, sharp and deliberate, and she pointed at my dirt-stained boots like they were evidence of some crime I'd committed just by existing. She said my place was on the ground, scraping mud off the heels of people who were born to shine. The silence in the courtyard of the Belmont estate was the kind that draws blood. Carter Belmont, the man I'd loved quietly for 3 years, didn't move. He just turned his head and poured more champagne for my sister. But there was something nobody in that garden noticed. Inside that stained sack I was gripping against my chest was the secret that would burn their entire world to ash. My name is Jenna Faris, and I grew up on a failing coffee farm in the hills outside Kona, Hawaii, before my family moved the operation to a struggling property in Central California, chasing a dream that kept slipping through our fingers. My father died owing more than the land was worth, and while I woke up at 4 in the morning to study soil chemistry and fermentation curves, my sister Brooke and my mother spent money we didn't have in San Francisco, pretending we were still the family we used to be. I kept a leather journal where I recorded every variable, every failed batch, every lesson the land tried to teach me. Everyone said the soil was finished. I knew it was just waiting for someone who understood its language. Everything changed the night the storm came through and stranded a man named Emil Strand on our access road. His sedan was axle-deep in mud, and he stood there in an Italian suit, surveying the property with the kind of silence that makes you hold your breath. He was the largest coffee importer in Scandinavia, the man who decided which farms lived and which ones disappeared. I offered him a tin cup of my experimental roast, a hybrid process I'd been developing for 2 years. He took one sip. The world stopped. Then he set the cup down and said in a voice that gave nothing away, "It's good, but it's not enough to change the industry." My heart dropped into my stomach. What I didn't know was that Carter had already reached Emil 2 days earlier and poisoned his perception of me, painting me as a desperate amateur trying to steal credibility. Before we continue, remember that this is still a small channel, and I could really use your support. Please like the video and subscribe. It's free and it helps more than you know. The auction at the Belmont estate was my last chance to salvage anything. I showed up trying to get 5 minutes with Emil, hoping to explain the science behind what I'd created, but Brooke intercepted me at the entrance. She called over photographers, made a scene, held me up as the ranch hand who thought she could walk into a society event. The laughter from the crowd felt like being stripped in public. Carter stood 20 feet away, smiling like he'd already won, convinced he'd bought Emil's loyalty with a contract and a down payment. But something happened that nobody expected. Emil wasn't done with me. He'd been testing me, measuring whether I'd crumble under pressure. He walked past Carter like he wasn't even there, crossed the courtyard, and in front of every camera, every investor, every person who'd laughed at me, he took the sack from my hands. "The coffee you gave me yesterday was a seed. I want to see if you have the spine to harvest what you planted," he said, his voice carrying across the stone courtyard. He opened the sack. The aroma of that roast, the one I'd been perfecting in isolation for 2 years, stopped every conversation. You could hear the fountain. You could hear someone's glass touch a table. Emil took a sip from the sample I'd brought in a small thermal container. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did. He turned to the crowd and said, "This is the future of what we import. Everything I've been looking for." Then he looked at Carter and said, "I'm terminating every contract with Belmont Holdings, effective immediately. You tried to buy my decision. She earned it." The collapse was instant. Phones started ringing. Men in tailored suits were suddenly making calls. pulling out of deals. Carter's face went from confident to pale in the span of 10 seconds. His empire started cracking in real time, broadcast to everyone who mattered. But that still wasn't the end. Men like Carter don't go down without trying to take you with them. 3 weeks later, I was in a courtroom in Salinas. Carter had filed an emergency injunction claiming the farm had never legally belonged to my father, that the title was fraudulent, that I was squatting on property his family had a historical claim to. His lawyer had documents, old deeds, signatures that looked official. He was smiling, certain of victory. The judge was about to rule in his favor. I was about to lose everything. Then I remembered the journal. The leather one my father had kept, the one I'd been using to track fermentation data. Carter didn't know my father had been smarter than anyone gave him credit for. Tucked into a false backing inside the cover were the original purchase documents, along with photographs of Carter meeting with the county clerk, cash on the table, arranging to have false deeds created. My father had known someone would come for the land eventually, and he'd documented the trap. I handed the evidence to my lawyer. The courtroom went silent. Carter's smile disappeared. The panic that replaced it was something I'll remember for the rest of my life. He was taken out in handcuffs under the same lights he used to stand in for press photos. He fell exactly where he'd told me I belonged, on the ground. Except this time there was no one to pull him back up. A year later, Brooke appeared at the gate of the farm. She looked thin, worn. Her clothes were generic, and her eyes had the hollow look of someone who'd lost everything that mattered to her. She asked for work, anything I'd give her. I stepped out of my truck, the new one I'd bought after the first successful export shipment, and I looked at her. I remembered that laugh in the courtyard, the way she'd held me up for public humiliation. I didn't feel hate. I felt something colder, something final. I don't hold grudges, Brooke, but trust is like coffee. Once you burn it, the taste never comes back. I handed her an envelope with enough money to start over somewhere far from here, but I didn't open the gate. I walked back to where Emile was waiting, standing near the processing barn, and the smell of fresh roast was already spreading across the valley. Because in the end, it wasn't money that saved that land. It was someone who refused to stop believing in it when everyone else had already written it off. The land had finally spoken, and the world was forced to listen. I'll be back with another story next week. The envelope hit the dirt at Brooke's feet, and she stared at it like it was something diseased. She didn't bend down to pick it up. She just stood there, her hands shaking, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in her face that looked almost human. "You're really not going to let me in," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word. "No," I said, "I'm not." She swallowed hard, her throat working like she was trying to keep something down. "Mom's sick. She's been asking for you." I felt Emile's hand settle gently on my shoulder. A silent question. I shook my head once. Then she should have thought about that before she spent 3 years treating me like the hired help while she burned through Dad's life insurance in Napa. Brooke's eyes went wet, but no tears fell. "I know what I did, Jenna. I know I was awful, but we were supposed to be family." "Family doesn't throw you to the wolves for a photo op," I said. "You made your choice when you stood next to Carter and laughed. You don't get to come back now that the money's run out and pretend you care." She bent down then slowly and picked up the envelope. Her fingers were trembling so badly she almost dropped it. "I didn't know he was going to try to steal the farm. I swear I didn't know." "You knew enough," I said. "You knew he was poison, and you stood by him anyway because you thought he'd take you somewhere I couldn't follow. Well, congratulations. You were right. I'm somewhere you can't follow now." She looked past me, toward the processing barn, where the new fermentation tanks gleamed in the afternoon sun, toward the expanded drying beds, the new roasting equipment, the trucks with Farris Heritage Coffee painted on the sides, toward everything she'd told me I'd never be good enough to have. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I know you are," I said, "but sorry doesn't rebuild what you helped burn down. Take the money. Start over somewhere else. Don't come back." I turned and walked away before she could say anything else. Emile fell into step beside me, his presence steady and grounding. Behind us, I heard the sound of Brooke's car starting, the engine rough and uneven, and then the crunch of gravel as she drove away. I didn't look back. "That was harder than the courtroom," Emile said quietly. "Yeah," I said. "It was." We walked in silence for a while, past the rows of coffee plants that had finally started producing the yields I'd been chasing for years. The air smelled like earth and growth, like something that had been broken and then carefully, painstakingly rebuilt. "Your mother," Emile said. "Is she really sick?" "Probably," I said. "She's been sick for years, just not the way Brooke meant. Sick with entitlement. Sick with the belief that the world owed her something just for existing." I stopped at the edge of the eastern field, where the soil was still recovering, and looked out over the valley. "I sent her money 6 months ago, enough to cover her rent for a year and get her into a decent assisted living place if she needed it. She sent it back with a note saying it wasn't enough." Emile made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been something sadder. "Some people can't be saved." "No," I agreed. "They can't." We stood there for a moment, and then Emile reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I have something for you," he said. "An offer, technically, but I think you'll like it." I took the paper and unfolded it. It was a contract, written in the clean, precise language that Emile's company used for all their agreements. But this wasn't a purchase order. It was a partnership agreement. 50-50 ownership of a new import and distribution company headquartered in California, with exclusive rights to develop and market specialty roasts across Europe and Asia. "I don't understand," I said. "You've been thinking too small," Emile said. "You saved one farm, but there are 100 farms like yours, maybe more, with people who know the land, but don't have the resources or the connections to break through. I want to build a network. I want you to run it." I stared at the contract, at the numbers that seemed impossible, at the future that was being laid out in black ink on white paper. "Why me?" "Because you didn't quit when everyone told you to," Emile said. "Because you understood that quality doesn't come from shortcuts or charm or connections. It comes from work. And because when you had the chance to burn your sister the way she burned you, you gave her an exit instead. That's rare. That's the kind of partner I want." I looked up at him, at the man who'd walked into my life by accident and stayed by choice. "This is real?" "It's real," he said. "Sign it or don't. But I'm not offering it to anyone else." I signed it right there, leaning the paper against the fence post, using the pen Emile handed me. My handwriting was shaky, but it held. 3 months later, we opened the first Farris Heritage roasting facility in Oakland. 6 months after that, we signed contracts with 12 farms across California, Oregon, and Washington. A year after that, we were shipping to 17 countries, and the name Farris meant something in rooms where it used to mean nothing. Carter Belmont served 18 months in a minimum security facility and came out to a world that had moved on without him. His family's holdings were liquidated to pay restitution and fines. The Belmont estate, the one where Brooke had held me up for public humiliation, was sold to a tech CEO from San Jose, who turned it into a corporate retreat center. I heard Carter try to start a consulting business, but nobody would take his calls. Last I heard, he was managing a car dealership in Modesto, selling used sedans to people who didn't know his name. My mother passed away 2 years after Brooke showed up at the gate. Cirrhosis, the doctor said, combined with complications from diabetes she'd refused to manage. Brooke called me from the hospital to tell me, and I listened in silence while she cried. I sent flowers to the funeral, but I didn't go. Some bridges, once burned, don't get rebuilt. You just learn to live on the side of the river where you landed. Brooke herself disappeared after that. I heard through a cousin that she'd moved to Arizona and was working at a call center, living in a studio apartment near Tempe. I hope she found some kind of peace. I really do, but I don't think about her much anymore. There's not enough room in my life for people who only show up when they need something. Emile and I got married on a quiet afternoon in December in a courthouse in Monterey with 2 witnesses we pulled off the street. No photographers, no spectacle, no performance. Just a promise made in front of people who mattered to build something that would last. We honeymooned in Norway, where he showed me the roasting facilities that had been in his family for 3 generations, and I showed him the fermentation techniques I'd been developing in secret. We came back with a new hybrid process that cut production time by 30% without sacrificing quality. The farm itself became something more than I ever imagined. We turned it into a training center, a place where people who wanted to learn specialty coffee production could come and study under real conditions. We brought in agronomists, chemists, fermentation experts, business consultants. We paid them well and gave them equity in the company. Within 5 years, 70% of the specialty coffee producers in the western United States had gone through our program. I still wake up at 4 in the morning, not because I have to anymore, but because I want to, because there's something about the early hours when the world is still quiet and the air smells like soil and possibility that reminds me of who I am and where I came from. I walk the fields with a cup of the day's roast, and I listen to the land the way my father taught me to, back before the money ran out and the world got complicated. The leather journal is framed now, hanging in the main office of the Oakland facility. People stop and read it sometimes, tracing their fingers over my father's handwriting, over the notes I added in the margins during those years when I thought everything was going to collapse. It's a reminder, I tell the new producers who come through, that the best work happens in the dark, when nobody's watching, when you're doing it because it matters, not because it pays. Last week, I got a letter from a farm in Costa Rica. A woman named Maria, who'd heard about our program, who'd been working her family's land for 15 years without a breakthrough, who wanted to know if there was room for one more student. I wrote back the same day and told her yes. There's always room for one more person who refuses to quit. Because in the end, that's what this whole thing was about. Not revenge, not proving anyone wrong, not even justice, though justice had its place. It was about understanding that the world will try to tell you who you are, where you belong, what you're worth. And your only job, the only one that really matters, is to prove that the world doesn't get to decide. You do. The land spoke. I listened. And now, finally, everyone else is listening too.